There is an overwhelming public perception that the greatest threat facing Africa's wildlife is the increasing presence of poaching syndicates who target the wildlife purely for financial gain. Certainly, the international media continues to highlight the horrors of organized poaching, which in some wilderness areas has indeed decimated certain species of game. But the looming and underreported reality is that the greatest single threat to Africa's wildlife is loss of habitat due to the continent's exploding human population. In 1950, Africa's population was 228 million. Fast forward to today, and the number is an astonishing 1.3 billion people who must compete for survival on the continent. That crush of humanity is projected to double to 2.5 billion by the year 2050. Without question, the evil of organized poaching has a negative effect on wildlife populations in Africa. Government corruption in certain countries is also an issue. These countries see wildlife not as a national treasure, but as a resource to be pillaged for political favor and financial gain. Yet both poaching and corruption pale in comparison to the effects of an uncontrolled human population on a continent already at a breaking point. To feed this swelling tide of humanity, wilderness areas will see man drive his domestic herds into new pastures that were formerly the sanctuary of game. Both commercial and subsistence farmers will put game country under the plow, as well as cut and burn acreage to clear land for crops, cattle, and homesteads. Add the blight of commercial mining and the tragic deforestation by unrestricted foreign companies logging at an unsustainable rate, and the game will be squeezed into shrinking and unsuitable habitat, and finally, tragically, into oblivion. Historically, Africa's wildlife has one great champion that has held the poacher, the plow, and political plunder in check. That is the value placed on game animals and their wilderness home by the hunter-conservationist. For it is the hunter who protects and invests in both of these sustainable resources. It is a fact that phototourism and any financial benefit it may bring only applies to the wildlife in national parks and private game preserves. In the remote areas of wilderness Africa, phototourism is almost non-existent. It is in her wild, undeveloped spaces where game will disappear. Legal, well-regulated sport hunting is and has always been the financial fuel that runs the engine of sustainable use conservation. Without the irreplaceable financial benefit that legal sport hunting brings to the rural people who live among the wildlife, the game will ultimately disappear, as surely as the human population swells to devour it. Without the hunter-conservationist, the game has no value other than meat for the pot or in the illegal wildlife trade. The wilderness areas that are its last strongholds will vanish, and mankind's future will forever be a grim reminder of the fallacy that the game could care for itself if only man would leave nature to its own devices. We must make a stand for the wildlife, the wilderness it calls home, and fight for science in place of politics as we face the battle before us. Africa's wildlife has no voice as change sweeps over it. It is our duty to raise our voice in these challenging times and to promote sound wildlife policies as this fight enters the next critical stage. Without us and the voice we provide, wild Africa will die in our lifetime.